They're tales of German soldiers struggling with the futility of combat, of Canadian soldiers fighting in an ill-fated campaign. And they are the stories that have helped shape our vision of the First World War. Almost a century later, what do these movies tell us about our understanding of the Great War? Well, here now to help us answer that is Seth Feldman, professor in the Department of Film at York University. Welcome. Hello. Nice to see you.
Hello, Piya.
Okay, we're going to be talking about how films that depict or address World War I have shaped what we see through the lenses of those movies. But first, let's just go back in reality. Taking me back 100 years, what's the state of film in 1914?
Well, it's very interesting, really, because it's the beginnings of modern film, in the sense. It becomes a mature industry. The first Hollywood studios, for instance, are coming up in 1912, 1913. And so you get the feature film becoming the standard for Hollywood around this time as well, and the standard for world cinema shortly thereafter. But the war helps Hollywood greatly because it cuts down the competition. German films obviously can't come to the States or can't circulate very widely. French films and British films are very limited because of the so many of the personnel are involved in the war, and the industry can't get the materials it needs. Unfortunately, at the time, film stock was made from the same chemicals that are used in making high explosives.
Right.
And so the priority was given to the high explosives, and there was a great shortage of film stock. So Hollywood enjoyed a great advantage from the war and used it to become as preeminent as it would be.
The Americans don't enter the war until 2.5 years into
Yes.
into 1970. How does America's entry into the war change what kind of movies were being produced during the war?
Well, before America's entry, I mean, there was a real propaganda battle going on in the States that other nations, the British, the French, the Germans, even the Russians, were making films for American audiences or sponsoring them to be made in the United States, arguing for the Americans to come in on or not come in the war, one side or the other, because there was a great debate over whether America should stay out. And right until the end of 1916, I mean, Woodrow Wilson's being reelected on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." So it's a very hot topic, and film becomes a very big part of that. There's a wonderful film by a very prominent filmmaker of the day, a man named Thomas Ince, who makes a film called Civilization. And Civilization is about this German-like unnamed country which has done these terrible things but regrets them and comes to salvation and can be forgiven without going to war against it. So it becomes a kind of a pacifist track, and it disappears very quickly when the war begins.
And as the Americans enter the war, and Hollywood's getting in on the action itself, producing its own movies, how much is the American government supporting the film industry at this
they
point?
do. They had something called the Committee on Public Information, which was very active in dealing with newspapers and with Hollywood in encouraging war-themed productions. They had a group of speakers who would go around and speak before films, who would alert people to their patriotic nature and tell them that what they were seeing was a true depiction of the war, no matter how melodramatic it was. But it went even further. There's a very curious film which was made about a book that was written by the last American ambassador to Germany. It's called My 4 Years in Germany, the last ambassador before the war, who had left it when America declared war on Germany. And it's a film that almost page for page, depicts his encounters with the German higher-ups, and they're all actors, they're all playing this. And it's also, coincidentally, the first feature film made by the Warner Brothers and distributed out of their brand new studio. So the Americans are very systematic, really, about using the film industry to describe the war. And of course, the great example is Charlie Chaplin's Shoulder Arms, because Chaplin, who really began his film career less than a year before the war, in 1913, by the end of the First World War, is the great film actor we know him to be.
And I mean, through history, I mean, people go to the movies to escape reality, and at this time, I mean, Americans are going to the movies, and reality is being depicted on the screen. I mean, what's the movie-going public saying about these kinds of films?
Well, it's strange because at this time when film is becoming a big industry, it also takes on a sense of importance. It isn't just light entertainment. And people go to the movies and expect them to say important things. And that was very well illustrated in 1915 with D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which, with its racist views and with its attempt to resurrect the Old South, causes riots in the streets and new membership in the Ku Klux Klan and the NAACP as people get polarized by a film. And that had never really happened to that extent. And so when the war comes, and at this period, people are beginning to expect that movies will say important things and say important things about the war.
And are they expecting, or are they even knowing that they're being fed propaganda as well, that is part of this industry at this point?
Oh, almost everything that was made, it had an opinion. Whether or not you want to call it propaganda, I mean, many of those people would say this is the simple, unprovable truth, and this is how it is. Griffith's films, his Hearts of the World is a melodrama that is completely propagandistic, except, interestingly enough, he had the cooperation of the British government when making it, and he stages these wonderful tableaus using the real people in the British government at these different historic moments. The tableaus have nothing to do with the melodramatic story, which is pure Griffith, but it's like anchoring this in the real world and showing, having a concern for a real history as he's making these films.
Okay, I want to jump a couple years ahead. Many years ahead, in fact, to the interwar years. We're recovering from the Great War. Movies are being made. How does the war influence directors and movie makers in the interwar period?
Well, this is different because the people making the films and the people writing the books from which the films are made and some of the people acting in the films are actual war veterans. And they have a very much more ambiguous sense about the war. I mean, a lot of them think it was a terrible waste. They lost a lot of their friends. They were through traumatic experiences, and it wasn't the war to end wars. Obviously, the world wasn't getting any better. They were in a Great Depression, or their countries were, were never the same because of the war. And so they begin, to make films that are like the literature of the time, either ambivalent or openly critical about the experience of the war.
So probably one of the best known is All Quiet on the Western Front, which comes out in 1930, a film that depicts life, daily life in the trenches. Is there something unique about this? I mean, it's a good story. It's a good yarn, to put it simply. But is there something unique about how it went about telling the story?
Well, yes, because it's a German novel. That was very popular in Germany and reflected the cynicism toward the war that had grown up there. But then it's made in the United States. And to me, what's interesting about it is because it's about the German army, the American studio could take a great many more liberties in showing how awful the war was than it would have been had it been about the American army. Because in the American army, the war is bad, but we're heroic and we believe in it, and the army is doing the right thing. With All Quiet on the Western Front, they could show the enemy army and show that the war is just bad, period, and there was no great cause here, and there was and it was just a waste of everybody's time, and it was serious. Sorry that they had done it. And the great scene in the war is when the soldier returns to his high school, where the teacher had convinced he and his classmates to join up at the beginning of the war, and he returns after all his experiences, and the teacher's still doing that, and the teacher's very proud of him and tells him to stand up in front of the class and tell him what a wonderful struggle it is, and the guy just tears into him and tells him, what a waste the whole thing was, and tells the students not to be, suckered into this, and they boo him out of the classroom. I mean, they just throw them out.
It's not just Americans, obviously, who are making movies about the war. I mean, this is going on across the world. How do other countries approach making movies about the Great War at this point?
Well, at this point, you get films like G.W. Pabst's West Front 1918, which is a German film about the German experience, which is equally cynical about it, but it takes it to a very personal level. Both of the protagonists in the film get killed. In the film, there's a terrible moment when the soldier comes home and finds his wife in bed with another man, and the other man is the local butcher because it's so hard to find food. And they try to restore a kind of normalcy to their lives in this very tense scene after he discovers her, and it's impossible. I mean, it's a way of saying, that she's betrayed him the way the war has betrayed him. That they can't go back to a normal relationship. He can't go back to a normal relationship with the old values of his country either. And he goes back to the front and realizes that the war itself is his home. That there's nothing left except this abysmal experience that eventually kills him.
One of the other big movies of the time in these interwar years is La Grande Illusion, Jean Renoir's film. For people who haven't seen it, The Grande Illusion, what's it about? Because it is cast about as one of the best war films ever.
Well, it has a very simple plot that an officer, an upper-class aristocratic officer, and a pilot go up to do some reconnaissance work, get shot down by the Germans by a kind of Baron von Richthofen type, who invites them to his officers' club, and then they go off to be prisoners. And after years of attempts at escape, the two of them are sent to the toughest prison camp in Germany, which is run by this same officer, Erich von Stroheim, who made his career at this point playing, sadistic German officers. And through all of this, there's this kind of continuing ironies going on, and almost every line undercuts the line before it. A lot of it is based on the conflict between nationalism and class identities. And so the German officer and the French officer have friends in common. They speak each other's languages. They speak English when they don't want the commoners to hear them. They understand what they're saying. They speak English to each other. And so when they're in conflict, they also have this bond. And you'll have to wonder, which of these bonds are more important to them. And the same is happening with the working class characters, who have their own bonds and their own problems between them, but have a common language and a common view of the world.
We want to play a clip from him. This is one of the POW officers, de Boldieu. He's taunting the guards, urging him to surrender. Let's take a look at this.
Boldieu! Boldieu! Have you really gone insane? I am perfectly sane! Boldieu! Boldieu! You understand that if you do not obey my order now, I'll have to shoot. I dread to do that. I beg you, man to man, come back.
It's damn nice of you, Raffenstein. But it's impossible.
Halt! Halt! Halt!
What's Renoir trying to do there? What's the sentiment he's trying to get across as a filmmaker?
Well, these are the two aristocratic officers, and they have a kind of bond between them. And the French officer is creating a diversion so two of his fellow POWs can escape this impenetrable castle. And he's doing it for, these two working class soldiers who, and the German officer finds it inconceivable that he has anything to do with them in the first place. But now he's sacrificing his life for them in doing this. And there's a scene directly after this where Boldieu is lying in bed dying, and Raffenstein, Erich von Stroheim, is apologizing to him and saying, "Oh dear, I just meant to shoot you in the leg," and Boldieu says, "Think nothing of it. It was dark. I was running. It was a very difficult shot." And they're being these genteel, aristocratic types, the types who die off during the war, who become less important. I mean, this is a war in which 4, I believe, old dynasties fall, and the whole idea of the importance of royal heads of state is forever destroyed in Europe, and so you have this moment of Renoir reflecting on that, within the plot of the war film itself.
So this comes out in 1937, La Grande Illusion. 2 years later, we're at the Second World War.
Right.
I mean, in terms of films that are coming out, how much does World War II sort of supplant the First World War when it comes to film?
Well, for a long time it does, totally. I mean, the First World War is seen as a prelude, if anything, is kind of the Second World War's unfinished business. And the Second World War films are, well, there's a lot more of them. They're a lot more complicated. Everybody is making them, and the war is taking place on many different fronts. Some of them are terribly racist, much more than was true in the First World War. And so you have a whole different agenda for them. But there are examples, and my favorite is Sergeant York by Howard Hawks. And in Sergeant York, the story of Sergeant York is an Appalachian hillbilly, basically, and he's belongs to a pacifist church. And he gets his draft notice, and there's great talk about what he should do, and he tries to become a conscientious objector, and he's turned down, and he goes to the army camp. And there's a long sequence in which his commanding officer, talks him into being a soldier. And this is like right out of the Second World War. I mean, we're a peaceful people. We don't believe in killing people, but we got to do it. And it becomes very much a template for the kind of propaganda that comes out during the Second World War, in the States anyway.
So Path to Glory, which apparently everyone in the world has seen except for me. I just watched it this past weekend with Kirk Douglas. Comes out in 57. For the few other people who haven't seen this film, what's it about?
Well, it's taken from a novel, which is a kind of a treatment of a number of true incidents that happened in the French army, where a division either mutinied or refused to go after an impossible objective, or failed to take an impossible objective.
Yeah, this is a World War I film.
In World War I, yeah. And most objectives were pretty impossible then, charging across no man's land and into the machine guns and gas and artillery and everything else. So this is about a poorly planned attack that fails. And the French army had this delightful custom of blaming an entire unit and picking men at random and shooting them for cowardness. And the novel is about one of these incidents, and Kirk Douglas plays the French officer of this who led this attack, and realizes what a terribly planned, awful thing it was to do. And he's a lawyer in civilian life, so he decides to defend these three men in this kangaroo court-martial that is meant to find them guilty so they can be executed. And he fails because it's all stacked against him. It's all a done deal anyway. And they are duly executed. And in the end, I mean, he loses all faith in the war. It's a very bitter, dark, anti-war film.
I want to play, actually, the final scene of this movie, because it's important when it's the French soldiers listening to a German woman sing German folk songs.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at this one.
Das war für mein treuer Cousin, der liebt sein Mädchen ein ganzes Jahr. Es war einmal ein treuer Cousin, der liebt sein Mädchen ein ganzes Jahr. Ein ganzes
Okay, Seth, that's the closing scene. It's incredibly moving, that scene.
Oh, it is.
What makes it? Why does it work?
Well, it comes after the execution. Kirk Douglas is going back to his quarters, utterly despondent, and he hears this coming out of the cafe. And at the beginning of the scene, the men are being men, and this poor German woman is dragged to the stage in this bar, and the owner is telling her to sing, and she's terrified, and these French soldiers are whistling and clapping and cheering and expecting God knows what, and then she starts singing, and all of a sudden, as you see, they are terribly moved by any kind of compassion or just plain music or the sight of a woman. One of the persistent characters in the World War I films is the woman, because there are, in war films, there are so few opportunities to show a female character. And when you do see one within the war film, she's very often transformative, and she's very often an embodiment of the soldiers' fantasies about what they have lost, and this contact with civilization in the form of a woman.
I want to talk a little bit about Canadian film in terms of its portrayal of World War I. I mean, we're going to show a clip from Passchendaele in just a second, but what other movies come to mind when we talk about that?
Well, there's the great Canadian World War I silent film was a film called Carry On, Sergeant. And this was made specifically because a group of Canadian veterans of the war were very upset that Canada was never mentioned in World War I films. And it was made in the late 1920s. And unfortunately, it was made as a silent film just as sound was coming in. So it disappeared very quickly. But they put together enough money to make a war film and to hire a cast of dozens, if not thousands, to portray, all of World War I. And it's about a Canadian sergeant at the Second Battle of Ypres who dies heroically at the end. And this became, an indication, really, because it never was seen by very many people, but an indication of how many Canadians felt that the war had, that their participation in the war, which had been enormous and had been a really traumatic moment in the country's history, had been ignored.
Okay. That's 1920 that comes out?
That comes out in 1928, I believe.
1928,
yeah.
Okay. I want to talk to you also about a film that comes out in 2008. I think Passchendaele comes out. All right, this is the Paul Gross movie. Yeah. This is the most expensive film ever made in this country. Mm-hmm. What's Passchendaele concentrate on?
Well, I like Passchendaele for one reason, because because he's realized that nobody talks about Canadians in great war films, is trying to get out, every aspect of Canada's participation in the war. And so he has, the British recruiting sergeant who is drumming people into the war for all the wrong reasons, the valiant Canadian nurse, and Canadian nurses were particularly valued. They were the only nurses I found out who were given commissions. They were lieutenants in the Canadian Army, and other nurses were just treated as kind of servants. And they, anyway, so one of the characters is one of these very strong women who's a nurse. Another one becomes, her brother becomes a sort of victim of the war. And I think it has that kind of same anger about, here we are never having been portrayed in the war, and this is what we went through. And it draws upon a kind of heritage of the images of the war in Canada. It's a nice catalog, if you want, of how Canadians think about World War I.
Okay, I want to play a little bit. This is this scene where Paul Gross's character is rescuing Canadian soldier from behind German lines. Let's take a look. Okay, Seth Feldman. So Passchendaele, only one of a few Canadian films that talks about Canadians' efforts during World War I. Put that into the grander context of all the films that we've been talking about. I mean, a century out, what do you think films about World War I should mean to us today in 2014?
Well, the way they have been, and the British are the leaders in this. I mean, I think BBC should pay royalties to World War I for all the programs they've made about it, are making about it, and both as documentaries and feature films. But what it should mean to us today, I think, is now we're sort of left alone with the archive. 100 years out, a centennial is a kind of celebration, if you want to call it a celebration, of the fact there's no longer a living memory. And all the soldiers are dead. Almost everybody who has any memory at all of the First World War has died. And we can only know it the way we know other old historical events through archival materials. And so the war films we make today are as much, I think, about the archives as they are about the war themselves, are about what we have to remember the war by. And this is kind of where film comes in as an historical tool, because this is a way of, this is what we're left with as envisioning the war, as our history of envisioning the war. And I think it's impossible to study the war today without studying the ways in which we've envisioned it in the past.
Seth Feldman, thank you. This is really interesting. Thank you for taking us back through this archive of World War I films. Thank you very much for coming
Thank you, Piya.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.